Well, in contrast to last week's chapter of our summer book, Karen Armstrong's 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life, this chapter, with its innocuous title of Recognition, is rich in preaching opportunities. Because she tells stories. She starts out with a story of a woman who has a dream. She dreams of a suffering child and the children of Vietnam in the war, like those images that are seared into our memories. Those of you who are my age or older remember those on television next to Walter Cronkite's face. Her dream leads her to the memory of her own childhood as an abandoned child sleeping in the parks under bushes in Dublin and eating wax drippings from votive candles in the church. A life of abuse and horrors followed by sorts of salvation of the human kind. The woman of these stories is Christina Noble, and she speaks in this opening portion of this chapter of going to Vietnam to follow her dream. And there she sees two children, dirt poor and playing in the dirt itself, and one, after she smiles, comes toward her and takes her hand. The kind of gesture that brings pain to her. Before turning away, though, the words form in her heart and soul, those words that say to her, there is no difference between an Irish gutter and a Vietnamese gutter. She remembered that when she was the poor girl on the streets of Dublin, she needed one person to understand her suffering and her pain. One person to break down the differences that were built between her and the world. To see, as Armstrong points out, that there really is no us and them. A key to compassion Armstrong speaks of in this chapter. As I thought about this chapter, I thought of the many faces of recognition as compassion, like seeing another's suffering, like practicing the bearing of sight of suffering, like breaking down those feelings of us and them. It reminded me of a small but profound moment 20 years ago. I was a young man leading YMCA exchange groups to China. I took 8 or 12 teenagers to the YMCAs in China, and we went to meet people. And I remember this one moment. It was a simple moment, but profound for me. It was not programmed. It happened on a street in a city. I can't tell you which city it was. But it was a typical city of that time. There were more bicycles than cars. I understand that has changed. There were people going by on motorbikes with caged ducks to the market. There were police directing traffic. There were hundreds of people on the sidewalks. And here we come, me, a tall 24-year-old, if you can imagine, walking with 8 or 12 youth behind me, Americans. We must have looked like we came from another planet. And this moment happened where the whole chaos cleared for just a moment with me and a man who stopped in front of me. He looked at us, large noses, colorful clothing, tall. And he and I locked eyes in a way that was almost mystical. It was a brief moment, but for me, in my heart, something shifted. Somehow I understood there was no us and them. There was no me and him, but that we were one organism, one human family, as we say here. And that moment was made poignant by the next event. which was as we walked a little further, we walked into this big market that was very chaotic. There was a lot of people buying and selling things. And I was talking with our interpreter, and I turned to look at our youth, and I saw all the youth had made a circle with their backs to the Chinese. A wall of American youth facing each other. Almost making poignant that notion that for them, maybe what they needed was that feeling. But what they did was create a barrier between themselves and the people of their host country. Armstrong talks more about this notion of no us and them. And I've tried to live into that awareness that I had so many years ago. And it's come with a kind of ironic twist of being a minister or a public person in the world, and that is this, that many more people know me than I know them. So when I walk into a market in Dallas, Texas, sometimes someone who has met me 8 years ago or seen me preach once comes running toward me and says, "Daniel!" And I'm forced to make a choice in that moment. To greet them as friend or to create a wall that sometimes I need, but sometimes I put up in fear. Those moments have asked me to enter into a new spiritual practice, and that is to walk through the world as if I do know the people I see and meet. To walk into a theater and to a supermarket and onto an airplane as if the people there are known to me, as if we have met before. There's a spiritual practice in that I fail at often. Forgive me if I have failed on that with you. And it is also a moment in which there is a vulnerability, a breakdown of my own fear, vulnerable for me and for the others, because sometimes I walk onto an airplane and say, "Hello, friend," and the stranger there is forced to say hi. Do I know you? The face of compassion in this chapter on recognition includes this breakdown of us and them, but there is a deeper essence to me. And that is touched on in the poem that I read and in the story that Mickey read. The story of Abraham in the Hebrew Scriptures. A little teaching moment here, having nothing to do with the sermon. I say Hebrew Scriptures and not Old Testament because Old Testament sets up a kind of dynamic with New Testament that says the New Testament is better than the Old Testament. So Christians typically say New Testament, Old Testament. We say Hebrew Scriptures and Christian Scriptures, just to keep that in mind, okay? This story of Abraham is an odd story. It's not just, I believe, God's subject trying to please a vengeful God that happens often in the Hebrew Scriptures. It is the first story of hospitality. In this story, Abraham and God meet. But the divine is in the form of three strangers. In the 18th chapter, after Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Noah and the Tower of Babel and the calling of Abraham and Sarah's journey to Egypt and the birth of Ishmael to the slave woman Hagar, then a simple moment at the side of a tent. Genesis teaches in these stories and these myths, and before this moment, Abraham and God have made a covenant. I am your God, and you will be my people. You will be the father of the people. I imagine that's a little bit of pressure on Abraham's part. And then the tent. Now remember, after the tent is Sodom and Gomorrah and lots of terrible stuff, Lot and the pillar of salt, and Isaac born, and Isaac almost sacrificed at the altar, etc., etc. We're not dealing with that. We're just dealing with this simple moment, wedged between these incredible stories, the story of a tent, a man and his wife and 3 strangers. The strangers appear. Abraham goes out to meet them. He prostrates before them. He brings them water. He brings them veal, the fatted calf. He waits on them. Here, the Father of all Israel. It's a story of human kindness, a person, a man and his wife welcoming in the guests. There was a Newsweek article once, years back, by a man named Rabbi Niles Goldstein, whose blog, if you want to look him up, is called Gonzo Judaism. He's my kind of guy. I love this guy. He wrote about a trip he took on horseback in northern Mongolia. One afternoon, he comes upon a celebration of the marriage of a man and a woman. The men of the tribe were building a yurt for this young couple. The women were scraping leather and preparing the cloth. They stopped the celebration when the stranger appeared on the horizon. They went out to him, took him in. They toasted him with vodka and fermented mare's milk, passed around cheese and candy. The rabbi said, "I tried to do my best by schmoozing and taking pictures of the children. Never before," he said, "had I felt so welcomed as a total stranger into someone else's world. Their party became my party." He continued in his reflection on this moment, "Ours is a culture of excessive individualism, of the radical pursuit of our own needs and desires, and on the global level of unilateralism. What we need is the culture of interdependence that washes away the illusion of self-reliance." He concluded, "We have to atone for abandoning our process of community." Hospitality, hospice, hotel come from that Latin root hospes, that originally meant to have power and then meant to receive guests, to host the human exchange of giving and receiving. Hospitality, a form of compassion and recognition, is stretching yourself to include others, to include a larger reality, to make room for something new in your life, something strange, something other. It is the giving and receiving of vulnerability, of making the awkward okay, of comforting, of making space for another's reality. Something we try to do in this church. And we all do this from time to time. We are good at hospitality, and sometimes we fail at it, but the story says there is divinity in our trying. Rabbi Goldstein says Abraham's tent was exposed in all directions, welcoming, but it made him vulnerable. It is only through vulnerability that genuine community can emerge, that commitment and compassion become intertwined and inseparable, and both require a risk on our part. Hospitality, to give and to receive, to have the power to make a difference in how we humans treat each other, and to know the difference. The difference between a good exchange, a welcoming, and a receiving, and not. Remember, in exchange for Abraham's kindness, the strangers bless him, promise him a child to be born by his 90-year-old wife, Sarah. Sarah laughs at this. But the myth makes it happen, and Isaac is born. Born into a dysfunctional family for sure, but destined for great things. The lineage of Israel, the people of the Hebrew Scriptures. You and I have known hospitality, and you and I have known the lack of hospitality. In the class on Wednesday night, we heard touching stories of both, ranging from stories about strangers being brought into homes, sojourners on the road, or families being embraced, families from other cultures given a chance. And we heard about moments when that failed, when prejudice blocked the door to the guest brought home because of the color of his skin. We have all had that feeling of being welcomed, of being recognized, and we have had the feeling of not being welcomed and not being recognized. Maybe even here in this fellowship after worship, where everyone else seems to have important conversations with friends in those circles that can mean backs to strangers, walls to those who have just arrived. I have failed at that myself. What is required of us? To sacrifice a little of our time, of our own sense of what we need, to take a detour, to be a little vulnerable in our giving and receiving. When asked which was harder, the giving or receiving, our class said the latter. The receiving is harder, which puts the pressure back on those who can give, but also brings the blessing and the reward. To make room for others, to cross thresholds, to recognize those in front of us in need or merely in need of a friend, that is the task. Now, I'm not asking you to take in every stranger you see on the road. I'm talking more of a shift within, whether it comes out in the way you welcome people into your homes or meet a stranger on an airplane. That is up to you. There is danger in becoming vulnerable for sure. The people of the Sikh temple in Wisconsin know this. Witnesses there said he looked like a welcome guest. Some say he looked like a policeman. I'm not saying the stranger in the dark alley or the one who's carrying a weapon is the one to approach. What I'm saying is that sometimes the strangers in our lives are the people who live in our homes or work with us in our workplaces, or people we see every day. I'm suggesting that maybe more often than not we have little to lose and only something to gain when we step forward, when we become familiar with each other, when we make comfortable the receiving and giving between people. The poet said, "This is the world I want to live in, the shared world, all covered with the same powdered sugar and smiling." Call me idealistic or naive, but I just think Karen Armstrong and the work of the Charter for Compassion is asking us to consider that this might be a better way to walk through our lives than to walk through our lives being distrustful and in fear of every next person we meet. Naomi Shihab Nye, in another poem, wrote, "The Arabs used to say, when a stranger appears at your door, feed him for 3 days before asking who he is. where he's come from, where he's headed. That way he'll have strength enough to answer. Or by then, you'll be such good friends, you don't care. I wish you well with the giving and receiving in your life, with being vulnerable and open to the world you meet. May it be so. Amen.